This is Pat Monroe. Pat was a banker from a small town named Quincy during the Great Depression era. Now, Pat noticed something strange happening. He noticed people would spend their last 5 cents on a bottle of Coca-Cola instead of something a little more essential. He used this knowledge to convince the residents of this small town to invest in Coca-Cola shares. Now, this investment grew to large sums. It's said that a single share from Monroe's era is worth more than $10 million today and produces more than $270,000 in dividend income every single year. Now, in today's video, we're going to try and get one step closer to the success of this Coca-Cola Millionaires town. We're going to build our very own dividend yield calculator for ThinkOrSwim. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have a tool which allows you to analyze the dividend yield directly on your ThinkOrSwim charts. You'll be able to see not only how it's fluctuated over time, but the number of payouts that we have, what the current dividend yield is, and even if it's above or below a certain threshold that you yourself can set. Now, for all Volatility Box members, I have a special part 2 of this tutorial for you, in which we're going to be building the pro version of this dividend yield indicator together. Now, the pro version has one simple goal, and that's to help make it very easy for you to measure what the current yield is compared to what the historical yield has been. Here's the same chart of Verizon, and we can see that historically, the yield has fluctuated between, let's call it 4.3 to 4.5%. Recently, it's accelerated, and the current yield of 7.48% is much higher than we're used to seeing any time over the last 5 years. In fact, the current 7.48% is greater than our midpoint, it's greater than the 200 estimate of the dividend yield, and Verizon even has positive year-over-year growth when you compare it to the same time last year. In terms of our 4 different quadrants, Verizon is very clearly in the 4th quadrant with regards to its dividend yield, telling you that it's in the highest range that it's been any time, in this case, the last 5 years. So that's the goal of the pro version of this indicator. It's to allow you to make a lot more sense of the current dividend yield and have context around that information to make smarter decisions. Now, for everyone who would like to have the download in front of them as they follow along, I'll leave download links in the description box below for both this version of the indicator that we'll be building along with the pro version of the tutorial for all Volatility Box members. If you aren't a Volatility Box member, you can learn more about our Volatility Box memberships on our website. That's tosindicators.com/volatility-box. We have 2 different memberships based on the asset class you like to trade. One is designed for stock and options traders, in which we support more than 10,000 plus stocks and ETFs now. And we have custom web-based software that we've built, including a custom live scanner whose only job is to go and find you the very best volatility setups. For all futures, micro futures, and traders who focus primarily on the index markets, the Futures Volatility Box is a better fit for you, where we have 5 different hourly volatility models to help you adapt to almost any volatility condition inside of the 10 futures markets we study. Now, every Volatility Box membership also includes access to all of our premium indicators, along with things like the squeeze course and every single module that we build inside of it. The Dividend Yield Pro indicator is just another one that we're adding to the list. Now, let's get started by jumping straight into ThinkOrSwim and starting to write some code and build the dividend yield indicator on our own. We'll start with planning, and then we'll start by writing the code. Now, inside of my ThinkOrSwim platform, I'll click the Studies icon to go ahead and create my own indicator, and there click Create to open up this editor. Start by giving your study a name. I'll give mine the name TI_dividend yield. And here I can start by erasing all of the code that we have inside. Now let's start by planning what we need to do to build this indicator. The first step is, of course, getting the actual dividend. That's step number 1 and key to being able to unlock how we calculate the yield. The next step, once we get the dividend, is to actually calculate the dividend yield, and we're going to be using 2 different calculations. The first calculation method, if I say method number 1, is going to be simply taking what the current dividend is and multiplying it by the number of payouts. So if, say, the dividend is 65 cents, or in this case 65.2 cents, we're going to take that and we're just going to multiply it by, in Verizon's case, 4 for the 4 payouts. So method 1 is simply multiplying by payouts. Now the second method, the method that I think is slightly more interesting and a little more accurate, is the one in which we take a sum of the past 1 year's worth of dividends and we use that to calculate the actual dividend yield. So 2 different methods there. Now after we have the dividend yield, the next step that we essentially would need to do is calculate the number of payouts, so we can display that. So calculate number of payouts. We would also want to make sure that we have all of our input values, so things like our threshold value that we want to be able to let the user set directly from the study settings. And then finally, the last thing that I can think of is the actual label and chart bubbles for the output. Now there's 2 edge cases that I think we would also want to account for. Edge case number 1 is companies that don't pay a dividend. I think we would want to have some sort of an error message which pops up for those sorts of companies. And then the second one that I can think of is for those people who are trying to access this indicator on a lower time frame chart. The get dividend function, which is the one we're going to need to be using, that only has access to this dividend information on a daily time frame chart. So we need to make sure to assess that the user is on a daily time frame chart. So I think this is essentially our game plan for this entire indicator build. If we start by first declare upper for this indicator, this can be the very first line of code that we write, which tells ThinkOrSwim that, hey, this indicator should be plotted on our price chart, since we want to see the labels up here and the chart bubbles directly on our charts. Now, the first step that we have here is get dividend. In order to get the actual dividend, we need to use the get dividend function inside of ThinkOrSwim. The get dividend function returns what the dividend amount is for a current symbol. So that's exactly what we're looking for. And if we take a look at their first example here, we can see that example plots the dividends for the current symbol on a separate subgraph. So if I take the code that they provided in example 1 as our starting point, and we paste that in here, and in fact, we're going to need to comment out or declare upper for the near being. I'll click OK, apply. Now we can see we have the dividend of 65.2 cents, which is the same amount we see inside of our green bubble. So the get dividend function here, or plot dividend, is returning that same amount. If we take a look at the code that we just copied, the first line, declare lower, tells ThinkOrSwim, hey, plot this on the lower subgraph. We can delete that since we had our declare upper. The second variable here calculates the actual dividend, and the way it does so is by checking first, is get dividend is nan, which means does that value not exist? Is it not an X dividend day, or does the company not have dividends? If that's the case, carry forward the same value of this variable from the previous bar. However, if it does have a dividend, then update this variable with the actual dividend information. This plot variable is the one that actually plots it out on your chart. And if I delete that, now we will have no errors. So now we've captured just the dividend piece here, the 65.2 cents. That's what's being captured inside of this dividend value right now. Now, if we take a look at what this variable looks like at all times, I think that will help to give you an idea of how this variable fluctuates. If I say yes here, for when we want to see the chart bubble, we want to see it on the closing price. Inside of the chart bubble, let's say we want to see the dividend, and let's plot this as a yellow chart bubble. Now if I click OK, on our chart we'll see a lot of chart bubbles, and the chart bubbles, every single one contains a value with the dividend information. That's because this variable right here, if you remember, carries forward the value from the previous bar if there is no dividend. When we're trying to do things like, say, take a sum of the entire dividend, this metric won't work since every single bar will have a dividend value. So that's what I wanted to point out with this particular value as of this moment, this dividend variable. It's the fact that every single bar has a dividend value associated with it. It's either carrying a value forward or it's being updated with a new dividend if today is a dividend date. Now, if we keep diving deeper into the code here, now that we have the dividend, we can start to calculate, say, the dividend yield. Now, in order to calculate the dividend yield, we can first off do something very simple like, say, plot dividend yield, and just take our dividend here, and we can divide it by the closing price. And if I click apply, nothing will happen on our chart. But now if I click, say, add label, we say yes. Inside of this label, let's say we want to see the dividend yield, and I'll plot this label as color.yellow. Now if I click apply, we can see we have a number plotting up here on the left-hand side. Now, as part of this current dividend, all we're doing is we're taking this most recent amount, the 65 cents. That's not what we want to actually be doing. We want to, say, in this Verizon's case, take this dividend, multiply it by 4 for the 4 different dividend payouts, and then divide it by the close. And if I click apply, now we can see what the current yield is, which is 7.67% inside of Verizon. Now, this method of manually putting in a 4, that's not necessarily ideal. There's plenty of companies that say had a special payout. I'm not sure that I find this to be an accurate way of just doing it. Hard coding a value is something like 4. So instead, let's try and calculate how many total dividends we had over the past 1 year period. So let's create a variable called def total dividends. And this is going to be a counter of how many dividends did we have over the past 1 year period. To calculate that, I'll use the sum function. And inside of the sum function, I'm going to check if we had a dividend on any of the days. So we'll use the same trick that they did, which is first checking if we did not have a dividend. If we did not have a dividend, instead of carrying the same value forward, in this case, I'm going to simply say 0. Else, if we did have a dividend, the number 1. So this will now take a sum of all of the different places in which this value is 1. And this value will only be 1 on days in which we get the dividend. So that's how I'm getting to the number of dividends, or getting to the actual dividend days. And we're calculating this over the past 252 bars. So 252 trading days. And now if I click apply, nothing happens since we haven't plotted this. But let's output the total payouts now. So I'll add another add label, and here we'll say yes, and we will say total payouts plus total dividends here, and let's give this a color of white, and let's see what happens if I click apply. Now we can see inside of Verizon we have a total number of payouts 4, and if we test this on a different chart, let's say of something like PMT, where we did have a special dividend, we can see that the special dividend has been accounted for, where the total number of payouts is not 4, but instead 5 over the past 1 year. Now, if we come back to a chart of Verizon, we come back to the code, now we have the total payouts being calculated in this total dividends. We can substitute that in place of this 4 as the total number of dividends. Now if I click apply, OK, apply, now we can see our dividend yield is being calculated. However, there's one drawback to the method we just looked at, which is in methods like PMT, where it's instead calculating this using 5 payouts, where that 5th payout was actually not the same as what we actually see for our dividend. So that is part of the problem that I was referring to earlier, which is I'm not sure that this is the most accurate way of doing it, and that's why we're going to have a second calculation for how we get to the dividend yield. Now, the first thing we can do is for this method, the method in which we're simply just multiplying, we can say something like a special multiplier, which checks, okay, if we have more than 4 dividends, but say less than a certain number, so we know that there was a special payout, then we know we want to use the number 4 as our multiplier. But otherwise, let's say this company has monthly payouts, we want to continue to use the monthly number. So let's create a variable for that. We'll say something like def payouts multiplier. We'll call this that as our variable name. And here we'll say something as simple as if our total dividends is equal to 5, which is usually the case if we have a special payout, there's an extra fifth payment, then we're going to set this value to 4, else we're going to set this value to total dividends, which will be, say, the monthly value if we have monthly dividends. Now, if we use this value in lieu of this multiplier here, and I click apply, now we can see the value of PMT's dividend yield updates because it's now using the 40-cent calculation, and this value will match up with things like the ones on Yahoo Finance, etc. Okay, now, before we move forward, let's calculate the dividend yield using the second approach that I'm saying. And the second approach actually takes the sum of the past 1 year's worth of dividends. So let's go ahead and create the variables that are necessary to do that. Now, in order to take the sum of the values, similar to the trick that we used for the total dividends, we need to create one more dividend variable here, which instead of carrying, say, the past values, stores 0 if there is no dividend date. So I'm just going to copy and paste this one more time. I'll call this something like dividend 2. It's a little messy, but it works for the time being. And instead of having then variable carry this value forward, I'm going to say 0. And if this is not the case, then we're going to have the actual dividend value be stored as this variable. Now that we have this, what we can do is create a sum variable. So something like def sum of past year's dividends. And there we can say something like sum of all dividend to variable values over the past 252 candles, similar to the same trick that we used for the total dividends. What this is doing is it's checking this dividend to variable, which will return 0 on all days in which we don't have an ex-dividend date or any kind of dividend. And if we do have a dividend, it will return the actual dividend value in a dollar format. So now that we have the sum of the past 1 year's dividends, we can use that to calculate the dividend yield here using two different calculations. To do that, we need to split up this one plot variable into a switch function, and we need to allow the user to be able to control this switch function. What I mean by that is let's start by first creating the user controls. So our user controls for this is going to be something like input yield calculation type is going to be the name of this variable. And there's going to be a few options for the user to choose from. The default value will make default, which is the way Yahoo Finance, etc., all of those folks calculate the yield. And the second way we'll do it is using our 1 year look back approach here. And I'll close this out. Now, before we actually write the logic for this, if I click OK, apply, all that's done is allowed you to say, double click this study, and now you can choose between one of those two values. Now, right now, nothing will happen if you switch between those values, but we're going to write the code so that something does happen. Now, what we need to do is come into where we have our dividend yield section right here, and let's create some space in our code so that we can start to edit what we have. Now, the first thing we need to do is change this from a plot to a def variable, and we can close this variable out right here as a def dividend yield. I'll hit enter. We'll let this be inside of a comment for right now, and we'll get an error which says, hey, we never assigned a value to dividend yield. Let's start writing our switch function. For those of you that have seen some of our previous tutorials, this should be another practice run at defining these switch variables. We start by saying switch, and inside of this value, we feed in what this variable that you just created, the input variable. So here I'm going to feed in the input variable, close this out, and open a curly bracket. And I'm also going to add the curly closing bracket along with the semicolon, just so I remember to do it. Now, inside of this switch function, we need to define both cases, and each case is these two options right here. So if I start first with the default option right here, I'll copy this value. I'll come into our switch variable, and I'll say case, and we're going to define the default value. We'll come back to that. And our second case is the 1 year look back. So I'll copy this. We'll come in, and I'll paste that value right here. Now we need to define the dividend yield if the user selects each one. So if the user selects the default dividend yield, then we're going to, we're going to take our dividend yield value, and we're going to set this equal to the same function that we had just been testing right now. The default value takes what the dividend is. This is the dividend variable up here. And it takes that dividend, multiplies it by our payouts multiplier. This accounts for special dividends, things like an extra fifth dividend, and it divides it by the current close price. Now in our second case, where we account for the sum of the past 1 year, we take the same dividend yield variable, but this time we set it equal to the sum of the past year's dividends, and we divide this by our closing price, since this is our total actual dividends that we received over the past 1 year. Now that we have both of these values, let's see what our dividend yield looks like when we output this. If I click apply, nothing should change since currently we have this set to the default. Now see what happens to this 11.83% as I go from our default to our 1 year look back inside of PMT, which issued a special dividend. If I click apply, you'll notice that changed to 13.82%. So now this dividend yield that you're seeing has accounted for the special dividend that we're seeing inside of our charts. Now if we come back into our ThinkOrSwim code, let's look at our initial checklist. So far, we've calculated the dividend yield using our two different methods. We've calculated the number of payouts, and we have that outputted. We have yet to define our threshold value, so let's go ahead and do that next. Now our threshold value is going to be something that changes what the color is that we see of these labels. Now we can set a user threshold here, which the user can define, but we can set a default value of, let's call it 4%. Now the user can change this 4%, and based on whatever that threshold is, the color of the variables, or the color of the labels rather, will change based on if we're above or below it. Now our total payouts label is going to remain white, but for something like, say, our dividend yield, we can change the color based on if we're above or below a threshold that the user selects. So here I might say for our color variable, if dividend yield is greater than threshold, then color.light green, else we'll say color.yellow. Now if I click apply, we can see this label turns to green since it's greater than the default 4% value that we have set right now. Now one thing we can polish up is making this look like a percentage value. So where we have our dividend yield plotting in the label, I'll wrap that around an as percent function here. And once I click apply, that now appears as 13.82%. And let's give this some context as well. We'll say dividend yield. Whoops, and I'm missing a plus sign. Apply. And now this looks a little bit cleaner. We can also add in our actual dividend information by saying dividend plus, and we already have that value being outputted in the dividend variable. And to that, we can say a plus, and then we can add a divider here. So a space, a vertical divider, and then another space. And that will now update this label so that we can also see this price. Let's clean up the price value as well. So I'll add a $sign here, and we'll round this value to 2 for any of those odd cases where we have, say, 3 decimal places for the price. Okay, so this is looking a lot better. As of right now, we have inside of our indicator the ability to switch between 2 different calculation types. We can set a threshold value. If I say set the threshold value at 14%, which is greater than this dividend yield, we'll see the color changes. So now you can start to use colors as a little bit of a smarter mechanism to scroll through multiple charts. You can choose between 2 different calculation types. The 1 year look back, which uses the sum, versus the default, which just takes the current dividend and it extrapolates that for the number of payouts. Now the last thing that I think we have left to do is add in the chart bubbles, along with make sure we've accounted for some of these edge scenarios. So let's do the chart bubbles first, and then we'll account for the edge scenarios. So to create the chart bubbles, I'll say add chart bubbles. That's the function we use. Now inside of this function, I'll say yes to always plot these chart bubbles. And we'll change that in just a second. We're saying yes so we can test this. We'll plot these chart bubbles at the closing price. And inside of the chart bubble, since we can already see the dividend information in these green values right down here on ThinkOrSwim, we'll plot only the dividend yield. So I'll use the same trick that we just used here, the as percent wrapped around the dividend yield value. And we can also use the same color Boolean value that we just wrote for setting the color as green versus yellow. And I think this should be add chart bubble, not chart bubbles. And now if I click apply, we'll see a chart bubble on every single bar. And we can change this to only show by saying only on bars in which get dividend is true. Now we can see those bubbles only appear on the bars in which we have an X dividend date. Now I know these bubbles and these labels can be annoying for some of you. So before we move forward to these edge cases, let's add in 2 additional input values which allow the user to turn on and off the chart bubbles along with the labels. We'll start with the labels first. I'll say labels on. We'll set this to a default value of yes, and then chart bubbles on, and we'll set this to a default value of yes. I'll take labels on, and we'll plug that in place of this yes value for all of our labels that we have. And then for our chart bubbles one, we'll copy paste this value. We'll come back into where we have this get dividend in the add chart bubble function. And we'll add this as another Boolean. We'll say this condition must be true and get dividend must also be true. Now if I click apply, we test this out real quick. I can turn off the labels by setting this to no. The labels disappear. I can turn the labels on and we can turn the chart bubbles off. Apply, the chart bubbles disappear, and we can turn them both on by selecting yes. Now the last things we need to do are take care of these 2 edge cases that we have. The first edge case is for the companies that don't pay a dividend. For those companies, we may want to output something like, hey, this company does not pay a dividend. So we can come down here to our add label, and we can say something like add label. And we'll say labels on for when we want this label to be true. And we can say total dividends is less than or equal to 0. And inside of this label, we can plot the value this company does not pay dividends. And we can set this to a color of, let's call it light red. And this should have been an underscore. Now, one other thing that this prompts is we can also show these labels only if we have more than 0 dividends to be the case, in which case that's the only way we'll have total payouts actually show us something. So we can add an additional Boolean condition here, which says, and total dividends is greater than 0, which means that there must have been a single dividend payout. So we'll use that condition on the payouts, and we'll use that condition on the actual values in which the dividend shows, and we'll use that condition. Actually, we don't even need to include that on the add chart bubble, since if there are no dividends, then this value will never be true. So now if we test this out, if we come back to our charts, let's come to a growth stock that does not issue dividends, something like, say, Cloudflare. We can see in the red label here, this company does not pay dividends. All right, now that takes care of our first edge case. And hopefully you also noticed that none of the other labels showed up here. So that's something else that we took care of with that total dividends being greater than 0 condition. Now the second one is we need to make sure that the user is on a daily time frame chart. The reason for that is if we say come back into PMT, which we know does have dividend information, but we come into say something like a 1-minute chart, you'll see that the chart does not have access to the dividend information. So we need to create some sort of a value so that the user knows that, hey, this only works on a daily time frame chart. And for that, we can use the assert function. Right after, say, the declare upper, we can add an assert function, which is basically a function inside of ThinkOrSwim that runs and checks if whatever condition you say is true in order for the rest of the study to actually compile. So in our case, we're going to say assert that the get aggregation period, so the time frame chart that the user is on, is equal to the daily aggregation time frame. If this is not the case, then we'll say the dividend yield indicator works on a daily time frame chart only. And we can close this out. Now, if I click OK, apply, you'll notice there's this exclamation mark. If you click it, we'll see the error message we just wrote. The dividend yield indicator works on a daily time frame chart only. And if we come into a daily time frame chart, boom, you see the indicator plotting the way you would expect. And that's it. You've built your very own dividend yield indicator inside of ThinkOrSwim, which allows you to see what the current dividend yield is, how it's fluctuated over time, when it's been above or below a certain threshold, and you even have 2 different calculation types that you can switch back and forth between, along with the ability to turn the labels and the chart bubbles on and off. If you'd like to download the final version of the code that we wrote together, you can do so by clicking the link in the description box below. I hope you found this tutorial to be useful. Again, for all Volatility Box members, be sure to check out part 2 of this tutorial, in which we're going to be building the pro version of this indicator, and we're going to do that together, and you'll be able to build on the knowledge that you just learned in this tutorial. I'll see you in part 2, Volatility Box members. Everyone else, take care, and I'll see you in our next update.